Hi everybody, Mrs. Singerly here, and today we're going to be starting our unit on biochemistry for AICE biology, AS level. And so as you know, we've learned about basic chemistry, we've learned about atoms and elements, we've learned about how properties of water are really important for life on our planet, and now we're going to learn about the molecules that make us up. And so if you think about what did you have for breakfast, a lot of your foods, if you go to your pantry and look at the sides of the boxes, have nutrition facts. And if you've ever looked at those nutrition facts, you've seen these macro molecules, things like the fat, we're going to call those lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. These are large biological molecules. And what are they doing in your food? Well, they're the building blocks that you need to maintain your body. Your body is made out of those large biological molecules. And if you've ever heard the saying, you are what you eat, it is because you are what you eat. You take in these biological molecules, they're large, you break them down, and your body uses it to reassemble you. So this is what we call the study of biochemistry. Biochemistry includes molecular biology, which is the study of these biological molecules. And biochemistry specifically examines the chemical reactions of these biological molecules. And this has a lot to do with our metabolism. And metabolism isn't just, how fast or slow you make energy. It's the sum total of all of the biochemical reactions that are in your body. And there are thousands of chemical reactions that are happening every second in your body to keep you alive. So what are macromolecules? Macro means big, right? So macromolecules are all of the living things that are large, and all living things are composed of large molecules called biochemical compounds. And all of the biochemical compounds that we're going to talk about are organic. And by organic, I don't mean you buy it at Whole Foods. Organic, and we've talked about this in other units, organic means that it contains carbon and hydrogen. That's the definition that we're going to use for biology. And that's going to kind of clue us in that something is organic. So it has carbon and hydrogen. Now, sometimes these large compounds of life are called macromolecules. They're also, we're going to sometimes refer to them as polymers. We're going to talk about that in a second. And these macromolecules do all of the life functions. So all of the things that keep you alive, from excreting waste to synthesizing important structures, and vitamins, to transporting things around your body and circulating them, to maintaining homeostasis, those constant internal conditions. These macromolecules are key to that. And there are four main classes of these large biological molecules, and they are carbohydrates, fats, which we're going to call lipids. I always can remember like lipids, like if you touch your lip, it's kind of like squishy. Like you think like there's like fat in there. So I remember fats are lipids, proteins, and then the last group is nucleic acids. So if we think about this, the carbohydrates are going to be foods like this that you see on the screen. It can include starchy things, so things like bread and bagels and crackers and pretzels and tortilla shells. It can also include sweet things too, like candy and honey and syrup. Those would fall into this carbohydrate category. You have over here, you have proteins. These are going to be things like your eggs, your meat, your fish, and beans. Down here, we have our fats, our lipid category, so things like butter and oil, the fat that you see in meat like bacon. You'd also have nuts have quite a high fat content. And then our last group is going to be nucleic acids, and those are going to include molecules like DNA and RNA. Now, lipids are technically the only exception. We don't necessarily always call them like macromolecules or polymers. It's because they are usually smaller than the others. They're not necessarily made out of smaller repeating parts, so they're kind of like our exception. But I do want you to remember that we do consider lipids. They're kind of one of the four main types of biological molecules, but they don't necessarily form what we call macromolecules or polymers. So again, our four types of molecules that we're going to talk about are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and they perform a wide range of jobs in our bodies. Carbohydrates' job is to store fuel for future energy needs. That's why we eat carbohydrates. Maybe your coach told you to like carb load so you had energy for a meet or race. Lipids, one of the things that they do is they make up our cell membranes, which are really important to forming a barrier between our cells and the environment. Proteins are probably one of the most diverse groups and have a broad range of functions, ranging from structural support, acting as little machines to carry out specific jobs. Proteins are going to help send and receive signals in our body so we can respond to our environment and keep us alive. And nucleic acids, right, the DNA and RNA, those are our hereditary information. They're what has the blueprint for us and the instructions for making proteins, which is us and our traits. So you heard me talk about this word polymer. Many of the biochemical compounds are macromolecules we call polymers. Poly means many. And a polymer is a molecule made of many smaller molecules linked together to form a chain. And these smaller molecules that are in this chain, we refer to as monomers. So poly means many, monomer means one. And so we're going to link together these monomers in a chain to make our polymer. All of the subunits in a given type of polymer are going to be similar to each other in some way. And those subunits are going to be linked together by covalent bonds. You remember covalent bonds, right? They're sharing electrons. And we're going to link them together by a process known as synthesis. Synthesis means to make. And this process of linking monomers together to make a polymer doesn't just happen by itself. It does require some energy to do this. So this is just a little image. So here you can see our monomer. Our generic monomer is made out of these two small white circles and a dark circle. And hopefully what you can see in our polymer is that's a repeated over and over and over again. And so a polymer is really just a long chain molecule made up of a repeated pattern of monomers. And so the analogy that I like to use is with a beaded necklace, and you can see the image of the necklace at the bottom of your screen. The entire necklace really represents the polymer. And the monomers of the necklace, right, are the beads that get repeated over and over and over again. And the string that's holding our whole necklace together, well, those are our covalent bonds. They're how all of our monomers are going to be bonded together. And this process of stringing the beads together is going to be that process of synthesis. We're making something that's larger and more complex. And of course, this is a process that requires energy. Now, if we wanted to label this on the bottom, so each one, I just labeled this one as a monomer, but every single one of these beads would be a monomer. So this would be a monomer, 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 so on and so forth, all the way down. And if we put all of those together, we would get a polymer. So how are polymers made? We said it happened through the process of synthesis, but a lot of times, and especially on the Cambridge, on the AICE exams, they refer to them as condensation reactions. So this process of synthesis, we are also going to say is a condensation reaction. And the terms dehydration synthesis and condensation reaction mean the same thing. So sometimes they will be used interchangeably, but they're meaning the same thing. It means that we are taking out water. So dehydration, right? We're losing water. Condensation, we're taking out water, and we're using it to do kind of this synthesis to form a new bond. And so this is just an example of where I have OHH, that's H2O. I'm taking out water, and then these are going to form a bond together. And so we're going to take a look at some of these condensation reactions where we're taking out water to make something that's larger and more complex. The opposite of a condensation reaction is a hydrolysis reaction. The prefix hydro means water, and the suffix lysis means to break down or to split. And so basically what we're doing is we're adding water to break something apart. And so here what we would do in our chemical reaction, we're going to be adding water to split this into the pieces again. And you might be asking yourself, well, why? Like when you eat food, why do we have to digest it or break it down? Because that's really what hydrolysis is, it's digestion. And what we're doing is we're basically recycling what we're eating and putting it into our bodies to build something new that we need. Now, also just quick review of a chemical reaction. Remember that all the things to the left of the arrow, these are my reactants. All the things to the right of the arrow are my products, and the arrow means to yield. So here what I'm doing is I'm taking something called maltose and I'm adding water to digest it or split it apart. And my products are like glucose and glucose, which we're going to learn in the next lesson. Now, do you guys remember what were the 4 most common elements in living things? They were CHON, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And you guys already know these symbols. So hydrogen is H, oxygen is O, nitrogen is N, carbon is C. So that's how we would kind of write them in a molecular formula. But what I also want you to know is the number of bonds that can be formed. So hydrogen can only form 1 bond. So that's why only a hydrogen will bond to say 1 oxygen. Oxygen can form 2 bonds. That's why when we look at a molecule like water, oxygen doesn't just pair with 1 hydrogen, it pairs with 2 hydrogens because oxygen needs to make 2 bonds. And remember that has to do with the valence shell, that they want to have 8 in that outer ring so they're nice and stable. And so what they're trying to do is fill that outer electron orbital. Nitrogen can form 3 bonds, and carbon can form the most, can form 4 bonds. And so which out of the 4 elements could form the greatest number? It was carbon. And again, just to review, why do we consider carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids to be organic? Not because you find them at Whole Foods. It's because they all contain the 2 elements, carbon and hydrogen. So if we take a look, here are atoms. These are what we call ball and stick models. And so this is an atom, and the little stick is representing a single covalent bond. So this is an atom that can only form 1 bond. So that would be representative of hydrogen. This one can form 3 bonds. So that would be nitrogen. Let's see if you can guess this one. This one can form 4 bonds, the most. Good, it's carbon. And then this one can only form 2 bonds. That would be our oxygen atom. And what we're going to do is put these together in different configurations to make our macromolecules. Now you notice that carbon was able to make 4 bonds, and that is actually really important. Because carbon can make 4 bonds, we can make these really large molecules. Carbon can attach themselves to other carbons and to other kinds of atoms. Because it can make those 4 bonds, this is at an extent that's just not possible with other elements because they just can't make that high number of bonds. And so as a result of this, carbon being able to make 4 bonds, it can make chains that are thousands of atoms long. It can make rings. Those chains and those rings can have branches and cross-links, making these really complex large molecules. And these really complex large molecules are responsible for carrying out the life functions of organisms, and I have a little list on here. So these molecules are involved in respiration, which is not just breathing, but it's how we make energy. Nutrition, so how we get all of the vitamins and nutrients that we need. Transport, being able to take molecules and circulate them around our body. Growth and development. Locomotion, which is movement. Reproduction, how we respond to stimuli, right? If you see a bear and your heart starts beating faster, all of that has to do with your body being able to send messages back and forth. Synthesis, so making things in your body that you need. Excreting wastes, and regulation, which is maintaining homeostasis. Now, one of the things that we'll take a look at is how living things are organized. And it all starts, at the smallest level with an atom, right? That's the smallest version that still retains the properties of that element. We can put atoms together to make molecules, and then we can put these molecules together to make these large macromolecules like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And what we're going to learn in our next unit is, well, then how can we put these macromolecules together to make organelles and make up a cell, which we can put together to make tissues and organs and organ systems and eventually a whole organism. And you might be asking yourself, well, if all organisms are made out of carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids, how can we be so different? And so even though we're all made out of the same stuff, we're all made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. We all, have carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids that make us up. But it's the arrangement of those monomers into polymers that make us different. And that's part of what we're going to be learning in this unit. We can make an immense variety, like a ton of different polymers from a small set of monomers, and that leads to the great diversity that we see in life. Now, one of the other chemistry-based things that you need to know before we start learning about carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids is something called functional groups. Functional groups are a group of atoms that give a molecule certain characteristics. So maybe that's being acidic or basic or being attracted to water or being repelled from water. But they also are important to know because where you find these functional groups is where bonding is going to occur. And so this little OH right here, so it's an oxygen bonded to a hydrogen, that is something that we call a functional group. And where we find these functional groups is where we're going to connect these two monomers together. So it's where bonding is going to happen. And so this is just a list of the functional groups. And what you really need to pay attention to is you do need to know the structure. So these are structural formulas, and you need to know what they're called so that way you're able to recognize them in molecule pictures. The characteristics, you don't need to have necessarily memorized. Because a lot of it, from our last unit, whenever oxygen is involved, it's usually gonna, it's gonna be polar because the oxygen is so highly electronegative. When nitrogen's involved, it's also gonna be polar because it's highly electronegative. And whenever you see carbon and hydrogen together, that those are gonna be nonpolar because carbon and hydrogen are besties and they share their electrons fairly. So really what I want you to focus on is knowing the structure and knowing the names. So a hydroxyl group is just an oxygen bonded to a hydrogen. Get it? Hydroxyl. So you got the hydro for the hydrogen and the oxyl for the oxygen. Okay. You got a carbonyl, carb for carbon, and then you got the O in there is how I remember that it's with the oxygen. So carbonyl. And then you have a carboxyl. Well, a carboxyl has the C double bonded to an O. And then the carbon is also bonded to a hydroxyl group. So get it? It's a carbonyl and a hydroxyl together. So they put the words together, a carboxyl group. An amino group has a nitrogen with two hydrogens. A sulfhydryl group has a sulfur atom. The phosphate group has the phosphate with all these oxygens going around it. And then this last one is called the methyl group, and it's a carbon with these 3 hydrogens. And we'll talk about that more when we get into our DNA and DNA regulation videos, which won't be until until January. Okay. And that is where I'm going to end the lesson. Our next lesson is going to be learning about carbohydrates. I hope this was helpful. If you had any questions, be sure that you write them down. You can send me an email. You can type a private comment into Google Classroom, and I'll be sure that I, pop in and I'm going to check in with you guys later in the week, and so that way I can answer those questions and go over anything that you need help with, okay? All right, I hope you have a great rest of your day.